Hey there, 6th grade. In this video, we're going to explore quadrilaterals a little bit more in depth. If you remember in our video over polygons, we learned that a quadrilateral is a four-sided polygon. But there are actually special types of quadrilaterals based on certain characteristics, and that's what we're going to focus on in this video. Some of these you've probably heard of before, and some of them maybe you haven't. So there are 6 that we're going to talk about here below. The first is a parallelogram. A parallelogram is a special type of quadrilateral, and its characteristic is that it has 2 pairs of parallel sides. Okay, so in this figure here, you see that the top and the bottom sides are parallel to each other, and then the left and the right sides are parallel to each other. Not only are those sides parallel, but the opposite sides are congruent. So this side is congruent to this side, and the top is congruent to the bottom. A rhombus is a special type of parallelogram. A rhombus is a parallelogram that has 4 congruent sides. So not only are the left and right congruent and the top and bottom, but they're all congruent to each other. A rectangle is another special type of parallelogram. A rectangle is a parallelogram because it has 2 pairs of parallel sides, but those sides all form right angles. So a rectangle has 4 right angles. A square is a special type of rectangle. It has 4 right angles, but it also has all of its sides congruent. Next, we have a trapezoid. A trapezoid has exactly 1 pair of parallel sides. Okay, so in this picture here, the top and the bottom of the trapezoid are parallel to each other, but the left and the right side, notice, are not parallel. If those were to continue on, they would intersect. So only 1 pair of parallel sides for a trapezoid. And then finally, we have what's called a kite. A kite has exactly 2 pairs of congruent adjacent sides. And adjacent, for those of you who don't know that word, just means next to. So a kite is different from a parallelogram because in a parallelogram the opposite sides are parallel, but in a kite this side is congruent to the side next to it, as is this side. It's congruent to the side next to it. So in examples 1 through 3, we're going to name each of these quadrilaterals using these 6 terms above, and notice the directions say give all the names that apply to each quadrilateral. So some of these are going to get more than 1 name. So starting out with number 1. Okay, number 1, the most general name we can give this of the 6 above is a parallelogram. Now, even though it doesn't look like the one that we saw up in the chart, okay, if you think about the characteristics of a parallelogram, this figure meets those characteristics. A parallelogram has to have 2 pairs of parallel sides. This figure has that, okay? Its top and bottom opposite sides are parallel, and its left and right opposite sides are parallel to each other. So that makes this a parallelogram. But it is also, more specifically, a rectangle. And it's a rectangle because it has 4 90-degree angles. Okay, so we can call this a parallelogram. We can also call this a rectangle. Number 2. This figure we can only give 1 name, and that is a trapezoid. It's a trapezoid because it has exactly 1 pair of parallel sides. That would be the top and the bottom. The left and the right sides are not parallel to each other. Okay, number 3. This figure has a lot of names. The most general name we can give this figure is a parallelogram. The opposite sides are parallel to each other, so that makes this a parallelogram, 2 pairs of parallel sides. This figure also has right angles, so a parallelogram with right angles we call a rectangle. the sides are all congruent to each other. So because the sides are all congruent and it's a parallelogram, it's also a rhombus. So that's another name we can give this figure. And then finally, because it's a rectangle and all of the sides are congruent, we can also call this a square. Okay, so this figure here, more often than not, you would just call this a square, but technically it has the characteristics of all four of these figures. It's a parallelogram, it's a rectangle, it's a rhombus, and most specifically, it's a square. Okay, in examples 4 through 6, this time we're going to need to put on our thinking hats and tell whether each statement is true or false. And after we state that, we'll explain our answer. So number 4 states that all squares are rhombuses. Well, let's think about what it takes to be a rhombus. If we go back to our chart here, a rhombus is a parallelogram that has 4 congruent sides. So in order to be a rhombus, we know that all of the sides have to be congruent. Okay, and this states that all squares are rhombuses. So what do we know about squares? Squares have 4 right angles, and squares have 4 congruent sides. So because all squares have 4 congruent sides, that makes them rhombuses. So this is true. All squares are rhombuses because squares have 4 congruent sides. Okay, number 5, all kites are parallelograms. So let's go back up and look at what it takes to be a parallelogram. A parallelogram must have 2 pairs of parallel sides. A kite, down here, has 2 pairs of congruent adjacent sides, but it says nothing about the opposite sides being parallel. In fact, if you look at this kite here, if we extended these line segments, they would not be parallel. Those line segments would the opposite line segments would intersect if we extended those onwards. So because kites do not have opposite sides that are parallel, this is a false statement. False because opposite sides of a kite are not parallel. All right, finally, number 6, this states all rhombuses are rectangles. All rhombuses are rectangles. So let's look at, again, what it takes for a figure to be a rectangle. A figure is a rectangle if it has 4 right angles. Okay, and what does it take to be a rhombus? A rhombus just has to have 4 congruent sides. Notice in this figure here, this rhombus does not have 4 right angles. So this is another false statement. And it's false because a rhombus may not have right angles. Now there are some rhombuses that are rectangles, but that's not what this statement said. It didn't say some rhombuses, it said all. In order for all rhombuses to be rectangles, that means they must all have right angles, and we know there are some that do not. Okay, if you had any questions over this video, please be sure you've written those down for the next time you're in class. And until then, have a nice day. You're all wonderful people. Take care.